Riaz is here.
Now we are going live.
Okay.
And do we want to record, right?
Sure. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this. I don't know, this is going to be a talk or a discussion about the waterways and gender and heritage. It's going to be very interesting how the three intersect. This is a Heritage Day, and as Heritage Trust of Vadodara, we have been doing our Virasat lecture on this day every year. But unfortunately, last year and this year, we have been unable to do that because of the pandemic. And I guess this is the nearest equivalent that we could come up with. That would be hopefully very interesting because we got three interesting speakers. Especially good to see young people talking about heritage. And another, I think it's a very woke topic, that is gender. And then the third, obviously, water systems, how the water systems have been nebulous to the growth of our cities and urban areas. And hopefully it will be a very interactive and very illuminating discussion and talk today. I'm looking forward to it. In these trying times, I know a lot of people have got Zoom fatigue. I personally have a Zoom fatigue because every day I'm attending at least 5-6 video conferences, and at the end of the week, you want to chill out. But unfortunately, our life seems to have become virtual, and we have to start adapting ourselves to live in this kind of a world. And that's going to be more of the future. And the good thing is, as I think we were talking before the start of this talk, is that people can join in from anywhere. So we have got Priyanka joining us from New York, and then there are other people, hopefully around the world, all around India, various parts joining us. And I think what Heritage Trust is trying to do what we try to do is to try and create awareness about heritage, because heritage seems to be at the back of people's mind. It is something that people see as a tourist and then they forget when they're not traveling. It is not part of our mainstream life. And the challenge that we face today is how do we keep heritage at the forefront? And I'm glad that Navrachna University, with the Center of Heritage, has decided to partner with us today and come up with this beautiful talk and beautiful, it gives us a snapshot. It will not give you everything, obviously. It'll give you a snapshot of what we used to have and why, and what could be the future for such heritage structures for us in the future. So I won't talk much. I am sure you are looking forward to hearing from the speakers. I'll hand it over to Mr. Pratyush Shankar, who is the Dean of the NUV-SEDA and the Center of Heritage. So Pratyush, over to you, and look forward to a great conversation. I'm just going to put it as a conversation. So hopefully it will be a great conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram, for opening the stage. And just for your information, I think the work that you all have done at the Heritage Trust for decades altogether, and I was going through the website, is really, really exemplary. The kind of grassroots work, the way you have touched upon so many different heritage topics and made a difference in the city is really something to look forward to. So my job today is to introduce all the three speakers. At a personal level, it's a super proud moment for me because I have been their colleague also and the professor also at CEPT University. I'm sure all my colleagues at CEPT are equally proud of what they have achieved at such a young age. But before I go on to the introduction of the three speakers, and the three speakers are Priyanka Sheth, Tanvi Jain, and Ashni Sheth. I would just like to say a few words about the Navrachna University Center for Heritage Research. This is a recent center that has been established. It was established almost 6 months back, And the objective is very clear. We wanted our faculty members and students to be able to work together on questions of heritage. We believe questions of heritage are something which are important from the point of view of pedagogy. They are questions or issues that sensitize our students and faculty members to the larger context of the society. We are also very careful that we don't want to look at heritage from only a romantic perspective or a revivalist perspective, but we want to attach some contemporary meaning to this whole debate. We essentially see our space as a space that can contribute to deep research that our students and faculty members will undertake in order to help community, the city, and the country at large. So there is a component of research and there is a component of community outreach. So that's about the Heritage Center for Heritage Research. And presently we are working on 4 or 5 projects. We're working on documentation and research on Laurie Baker's presence in Baroda. We are working on, and not many people know about it, there are some wonderful buildings. In fact, the whole idea was, Priyanka, that we were going to have an exhibition today, followed by Heritage Walk the next day. That was the whole thing. So that, unfortunately, because of the COVID scene, could not happen. The second project that we are working on is the railway heritage of Baroda. And that's something that needs to be told. The third project that we are working on is on the banyan tree. It's called Word of Vadodara. It's a community participation project where we're going to involve citizens to map the word trees around themselves. So we almost create like an alternate map of Vadodara. And the fourth project is a publication of earlier student documentation. So with that introduction about the center, I would like to now introduce the 3 speakers. Priyanka Sheth. And as I said, personally, it's a very proud moment for me because I've known them since they were 18 years old, and I have such fond memories of them. And that's what good institutes do. They kind of motivate you to take things outside the academic environment and you pursue it. And it's so satisfying to see these young scholars really take it up on themselves and pursuing it from different parts of the world, pursuing a passion that they believe in. So about Priyanka Sheth, well, apart from the fact that we have worked on projects together, we have taught together, I was also a thesis guide. Priyanka Sheth is an architectural designer currently working for Bayer, Binder, Bele Architects and Planners in New York. Priyanka has special interest in research related to preservation, traditional water infrastructure, and the evolution of urban form in Indian cities. Prior to joining BBB in 2019, she practiced as an architect in India and has taught design studios and urban history seminar courses focusing on Indian cities at SEP University. She's one of the lead researchers for the presentation today for Stepwells of Ahmedabad, an ongoing collaborative research project focused on historic subterranean water structures called Stepwells, and co-curator of related exhibitions in Ahmedabad, as well as Yale Architecture Gallery and the Cooper Union. She's also the co-author for the book Stepwells of Ahmedabad, Water, Gender, Heritage, which was published recently. I remember those wonderful photographs on the Instagram post of the book covers. She has a Master's of Architecture from Yale University and a Bachelor's of Architecture from SEP University. So welcome, Priyanka. The second presenter and the collaborator is Tanvi Jain. I remember Tanvi, she was a national squash player and an athlete. And I still remember our related study program where our site was, I think, 5-6 kilometers away in Kudol in North Gujarat. And she would run in the morning to the site, and we would be all taking chakras to reach there. So that's the Tanvi for you. She's presently doing her MPhil in Cambridge. Tanvi Jain is an architect and researcher currently pursuing MPhil degree in architecture and urban design at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Her design thesis focuses on water traditions of semi-arid India, urban water infrastructure and water rights in support of decentralized systems, and self-sufficiency at various scales. She received her Bachelor of Architecture from SEP University and has been part of this project, Stepwells of Ahmedabad, since it was initiated in 2016. Welcome, Tanvi. I think you are in Indore right now doing online classes in Cambridge. The third presenter, Ashni. And again, Ashni, very, very intense and a very quiet scholar. I was, in fact, her thesis guide, and it was very interesting that I would be satisfied with the text, but she would not be satisfied. It was the other way around, in her case. So Tanvi is an architect and independent researcher based in Ahmedabad with a keen interest in landscape and architectural history. She received her Bachelor's of Architecture from CEPT University. Her research thesis explored the historic water harvesting structures in Chanderi, Madhya Pradesh. She has been part of the core team of Stepwells of Ahmedabad initiative since 2016. So with this impressive introductions of these three young scholars, I would like to invite all three of them to begin their presentation.
Ashin, you are starting? Yeah. So, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on the occasion of World Heritage Day. And I'm super grateful to Sandhya Gajjar from Heritage Trust Baroda and Pratyush for organizing this event. And I would like to acknowledge Riaz Taibji, who's in the audience today. And he was the founder of the initiative back in 2016, and he continues to remain quite engaged with this body of work as it grows. So I will, yeah, is the screen visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay, super. Great. So I'll be opening today's conversation by situating the Stepwells amidst a spectrum of other water conditions and settlement patterns.
Ashini,
Yeah.
will you please ask everybody else to mute themselves because there is some background noise which is very.
Yeah, we might need the audiences to mute themselves.
Yeah, I will
Just check.
I'll do that if no.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. You can start, Ashni. I think everyone is muted right now.
All right. Okay. So I'll be opening today's conversation by situating the Stepwells amidst a broader spectrum of water harvesting traditions and settlement patterns that evolved in Gujarat up to the 19th century. So, as most of us know, Gujarat experiences a semi-arid climate. We're all too familiar with the hot and dry summers and the drizzles and downpours between June and September. These landscapes portray the seasonal fluxes experienced across the region. Someone's phone went off anyway. Scrubby hills and plains become verdant, and dry riverbeds and lake beds get rehydrated in the monsoons. The major rivers of the region, the Sabarmati, the Mahi, Narmada, and Tapi, emerge from the hilly outcrops of the Aravalis and the Vindhyas. They flow across the gently undulating plains of north and central Gujarat and finally converge at the Gulf of Khambat. These rivers swell and flood during the monsoon, but are bone dry by peak summertime. However, beneath the vast plains, rich water-bearing soils and deep aquifers store percolated rainwater like a sponge. Here's a map of north-central Gujarat and various historic settlements like Ahmedabad, Patan, Vadnagar, and Mehta, situated across the various seasonal watercourses of the region. This shows that despite the absence of perennial rivers, human settlements have survived and thrived in the region for millennia. So these here are pictures from Dholavira and Kutch. The site contains ruins of what was once one of the grandest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, dating back to 2650 before Common Era. The Harappans excavated a series of interconnected rock-cut reservoirs to store rainwater and also diverted water from seasonal streams flowing nearby for drinking, sanitation, and irrigation purposes. In this picture, we see an 8-meter deep rectangular reservoir with a flight of steps for people to descend. At the base of the tank, another flight of steps descends towards a deep hole in the ground, which taps into groundwater. We may consider this to be the earliest known prototype of a stepwell in the region. Once the rainwater stored in the tank would have dried up, the well would have provided groundwater till the onset of the next monsoon. The structures at Dholavira are an illustration of the region's long-standing traditions of harvesting surface water as well as tapping into groundwater. So over a period of time, a vast network of villages connected by trade, agriculture, and pastoralism proliferated across the region. Our collective identified some recurring patterns between settlements and water bodies. In a typical GAM, dwellings are usually clustered on higher ground, and the street networks have evolved to follow the natural course of flowing water. The farmlands are irrigated by small ponds and dug wells. Before the advent of motorized pumps, water was lifted using a string of pots, as you can see in the corner over here. The string of pots is attached to a Persian wheel, which is driven by draft animals. Next to every gam is a village pond or a talavdi that is usually a naturally occurring depression, or sometimes artificially impounded by raising earthen bunds flanked by stone steps. The village pond captures rainwater and surface runoff from its surroundings and stores the water for many months after the monsoon. People come to the banks of this communal watering hole for washing clothes, bathing and feeding livestock, fishery, cremations, and other festive rituals. Besides serving as the settlement's most important source of surface water, another crucial function of the pond is to recharge the groundwater table in its surroundings. Between the gam and the talavdi, one often finds a vav or a stepwell. It consists of a large, deep well shaft connected to a long subterranean flight of steps. The stepped corridor is interspersed with stacked pavilions at intermittent landings to structurally support the sides from caving in and to provide a cool, shaded respite from the excruciating heat. Such stepwells have been built in Gujarat from the 7th to the 19th century Common Era. Wells were traditionally privileged as a source of drinking water, as sediments are filtered out from the water by the layers of the earth during the percolation process. Stepwells were frequented by women of the community for fetching water, as well as by itinerant people such as trading caravans, pilgrims, armies, and pastoralists. They not only served as places for water, but as important social spaces for the communities. However, people belonging to certain castes were often systemically excluded from accessing them. So, in the diagram on the left, we can clearly see the dependencies between the gam, the talavdi, and the stepwell. The talavdi replenishes groundwater reserves, which the vav then taps into. Together, they bind the settlement to the surface and depth of the earth. The map on the right illustrates the historic walled city of Ahmedabad and its hinterland settlements as per an 1820s survey map. The adjacent water bodies are marked in blue, and locations of various known stepwells are marked in red. The Gam Talavdi Vav ecology becomes strikingly apparent. As trade, religion, and craft prospered in the region from the 9th to 19th centuries, the building of waterworks was elevated to an art form. Architecturally elaborate water structures were built out of stone quarried from distant sites, not just for quotidian uses, but for religious and imperial rituals next to temples or mosques, as well as for pleasure and recreation amidst palaces and gardens. These structures vary in scale and form, as well as the method of storing water. So, yeah, natural depressions in the terrain that collect rainwater and runoff were sometimes excavated into formal shapes and embanked with stone steps, platforms, animal ramps, and pavilions to form tanks, such as the one at Sarkhej Rosa, excavated in the 15th century in Ahmedabad. Elaborate sluice gates and canals often channeled water from distant rivers or streams into these grand tanks. Artificial islands were often built in the center, offering a picturesque setting for erecting structures and laying out gardens surrounded by water. Here's an 1878 etching of Sarkhej tank, which depicts a pavilion, elephants, and rowboats at the tank. A kund is a basin shaped like an inverted pyramid for storing fresh rainwater. It is smaller in surface area but greater in depth than a tank, and thus incurs reduced water loss by evaporation. Its steep walls are buttressed by complex arrangements of steps. The 11th century kund next to Modhera Sun Temple is embellished with small shrines at various landings. The form of the kund is closely tied to the rituals of sacred ablutions and worship. This is the Kund Vav in Kapadvanj. It's a hybrid form that merges two sources of water, rainwater and groundwater. It consists of a stepped kund-like basin that collects rainwater, but the well shafts at its base and adjacent to it provide groundwater when the surface water has evaporated. It is flanked by a ceremonial gateway or a kirti toran. In this series of images, you can see how the water level recedes over the seasons and finally reveals a well at the bottom. This is the well-known 11th century Rani Ni Vav at Patan, which was the capital of the Solanki dynasty. The wide 7-story deep stepped corridor would collect rainwater during the monsoon, and the large circular well shaft was meant to provide groundwater throughout the year. While the stepwell has a linear form, its steps are arranged in triangular sets, similar to a kund. The walls of the well shaft are ornamented with thousands of images of gods and goddesses of the Brahminical pantheon, as well as depictions of women performing their daily rituals. Here are some glimpses of the structural and ornamental details of Rani Ni Vav. Ambapurni Vav was built in the 15th century along a historic trade route outside Ahmedabad during the Sultanate period. As Islamic stylistic values were patronized during that period, many newly commissioned stepwells were devoid of figurative or religious symbols. At the lowest level, a shallow pool precedes the well shaft. It might have served as a settling tank for rainwater cascading from the steps before it mixes with the pure groundwater. The cool shaded pavilions would have provided shelter for travelers. The 17th century Hariyo Kuo in Halisa is a type of a spiral stepwell. Such wells consist of a narrow step passage winding helically around the circular well shaft. These subterranean chambers open towards the well from all sides and serve as a cool retreat. And finally, the Taka. In prosperous, dense neighborhoods of cities like Ahmedabad and Bharuch, harvesting water from the rooftop of homes was a common practice. Underground cisterns or takas were dug between the foundations of traditional house forms. Water from the taka would be drawn from a narrow, lime-coated shaft in the courtyards of these houses. Traditionally, the takas were known to suffice most of the household water requirements of these urban homes. Finally, I would like to address some of the communities that were associated with building and operating these water structures. Odes are a community of nomadic pond and well diggers. Traditionally, they had an expertise in assessing and excavating the earth. To build a well, first they would excavate the earth with the help of pulleys and baskets. Then a circular wooden ring would be suspended by pulleys into the pit and serve as a scaffold as well as formwork for lining the well with stone, layer by layer. Somparas were a guild of highly skilled stone craftsmen who cut, sculpted, and assembled the building elements in stone. In a typical stepwell, the stonework is executed in tiers from bottom to top. The sides of the stepped corridor are retained using rubble and finally faced with stone veneers and decorative bands and niches. The modular column beams and slabs for the pavilions were assembled with mortarless joints. Vishtis were a community of water carriers who filled water from wells in leather sacks and carried them around town, or accompanied traveling caravans and armies and offered people water. So far, we have established the environmental and social ecosystems in which the stepwells were historically rooted. Today, hundreds of stepwells can still be found next to village ponds across the region. However, they're no longer used as sources of drinking water. They started falling into disuse from the late 19th century onwards due to the shift towards centralized pipe water supply and private ownership of motorized bore wells. In the era of rapid population growth, urbanization, and climate change, their meanings and uses have now altered. Priyanka and Tanvi will further elaborate on the current condition of the stepwells of Ahmedabad and their potential in combating the city's water crisis. Thank you.
So from this, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. From here, I'll take over, and thank you, Ashini, for a wonderful presentation. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, Priyanka.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right. So in this part of the talk, I shall focus on the stepwells in and around Ahmedabad, and also a little bit about the initiative that led to this documentation. So we saw in Ashini's presentation the settlement pattern of North Gujarat, and the city of Ahmedabad emerged on the Sabarmati River in 1411. Sultan Ahmad Shah, the ruler of Gujarat, of the Gujarat Sultanate, built a citadel on the eastern bank of the river Sabarmati, and then over time, Ahmedabad grew into a dense walled city. So outside the city, the rulers allotted plots of land to courtiers, merchants, religious figures, and so on, and encouraged them to develop the land into a network of productive suburbs, which were known as puras. And actually, many neighborhoods in Ahmedabad still have the pura associated with the name, Navrangpura, Naranpura, and so on. So you could kind of trace the name going back to that idea of the suburb outside of the walled city. And then, so in this hand-painted map to the left, you can see the fortified city, which is right there, and the depiction of the various settlements, suburbs, gardens, and so on. And to the right is, again, a map that Ashini showed, and I just want to reiterate that. It's a map that is reconstructing the historic landscape of Ahmedabad. And for this map, we looked at various historic maps, travelers' accounts, and also located the stepwells that our initiative, our collective documented, which are these little dots in red. And that's that kind of, these two maps kind of give us an idea of the landscape of Ahmedabad and and outside of the city as well. And important to Ahmedabad is is the river. So as a seasonal river, the Sabarmati swells up in the monsoon and it contracts in the summer, leaving dry patches of land. And during its dry period, the riverbed becomes an expansive public space, bustling with temporary markets, but it is also used for seasonal farming, fishing, washing, dyeing, and drying of textiles, as you can see in these images. So the puras, or the settlements that I described in the previous slides, which were outside of the walled city, have now been inundated by urbanization and are now incorporated within the metropolitan limits of Ahmedabad today. So this Google image is Ahmedabad today, with the locations of the stepwells, which we documented in red. And I'm going to now talk a little bit about how we went about locating these stepwells. So Google imagery, satellite imagery, helped us identify former historic settlements and their adjoining reservoirs, or the catchment areas, or the talabs, or the talaus, which often indicated the presence of a stepwell. And many of these lakes have been built over or filled in or disappeared. And that alteration also, the alteration of the landscape is also reflects in the fact that a lot of these stepwells do not have water anymore. So to locate many of these stepwells, we would first locate the reservoir or pond on the satellite map, and then we would go and look for the stepwell. Many times, like I said, we would go to a location only to discover that the stepwell had been built or buried, and there are stepwells which have actually disappeared, so to speak. And so in the process of going around the city to locate these stepwells, we had chats with the people who lived around these stepwells. You know, we as architects probably did not know of the number of stepwells that existed, but people have been living around, and it's a part of their routine, it's a part of their environment. And so and that's talking to people was one of the ways how we were able to locate so many of these stepwells. And in our conversations with them, we would say, oh, we are architects and students interested in studying stepwells, and do you happen to know of them? And very often they would enthusiastically refer to a stepwell that they knew from their childhood days, and they would even join us as we would go about locating them. And for around 7 or 8 months, this was our routine, roaming around the city, trying to locate as many stepwells as we could, and asking people if they knew of more. So the people of the city have been instrumental in helping us locate the stepwells. And it became apparent that the stepwells were a recurrent typology, deeply embedded in the city, and this reinforced the need to look beyond their role as relics and to start a conversation about their legacy within the subcontinent's larger culture of harvesting water. And so in 2015, this collaborative was launched by Riyaz Tayyabji of Antil Design, and our collective basically started drawing and documenting them. And this work continues to evolve. And we have been presenting our work through various formats, through exhibitions, through conversations and talks like this, and more recently a book. So our very first exhibition was in Ahmedabad at the Kanoria Center for Arts and at the Gandhi Memorial Museum. And then we brought that exhibition here to the US, where I'm based at the moment. And also its online version, and it's interesting to see how with time this work is evolving, and the format in which we present has been evolving as well. It is important to emphasize the conversations that have fueled this work in many ways, starting from the very first exhibition where we invited guest speakers to bring in different perspectives and share their knowledge of larger issues of water, and also bringing this work to a very different audience in the United States through the exhibition at Yale University and its online pandemic version at the Cooper Union. So we have engaging with different people, different scholars and so on has also been an integral part of this initiative. And over the years, our work and collaboration has only grown, and more recently we were able to put a small publication together. That said, this is all ongoing work in progress, and this will continue to occupy us hopefully for a long time, even going forward. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the documentation itself. Our team has measured and drawn 17 stepwells in the city. The oldest one we documented it was in the 11th century, and the most recent one was the 19th century, by when they had already started entering a state of decline, and my colleague Tanvi will talk more about that. But the variety of scales and configurations was astounding, and is also a result of their specific location and also patronage. Some rather large and ornate ones were commissioned by noble men, women, or wealthy merchants, but one can imagine that the more modest structures were probably built by the community to meet their water needs. And we observed that those within the walled city were typically smaller than the ones outside. In this diagram, you can see all the stepwells that we documented drawn at the same scale, and you can see how big this one is and how small that one is. And also, looking at these stepwells in relation to the other pre-colonial typologies, as you might call them, which is the citadel, the mosques, the various tombs, and really imagine what the stepwells were with respect to other typologies as well, as is illustrated in this drawing. So now I will talk a little bit about the current condition of some of these stepwells. It's not all of them, but they are representative of the current state of these stepwells in Ahmedabad. And this one, as many of you might know, is Rudabai Nivav in Adalaj, built in the 15th century, extremely intricately carved, and is one of the few stepwells that still has water. Now, the artisanal village of Adalaj was a crucial halting point along the trade route to the port of Khambat and was an important textile manufacturing center. These images show the octagonal well shaft and the pool of water at the lowest level, which is 5 stories below ground. The stepwell is intricately ornamented with exquisite sandstone carving featuring patterns and animals, figurines, and it was commissioned by a noble woman, Rudabai. And an inscription in the stepwell states that the patroness provided funds from her own personal treasury for construction. Many of these stepwells were commissioned by women, and this is very beautifully elaborated in the work of the scholar, Dr. Purnima Mehta Bhatt. And I think one of the things that she does so emphatically is challenge the stereotype of women as passive by shedding light on their agency as patrons, frequently as sole donors to these stepwells. And I highly encourage people to look at that book as well if they're more interested in this topic of patronage and agency of women. But however, it was the daily routines of many women that linked them directly to the stepwell. Their social lives were woven with these structures as the routine task of fetching water for families was relegated to women. And in the subcontinent, in many parts of the subcontinent, even today, this labor is performed by women. Stepwells became social and recreational spaces where women enjoyed uninhibited the company of one another in the cool depths of the earth. And it was at the stepwell that they would share their joys and sorrows, even discuss politics and seek the companionship of other women. In this beautiful photograph from the 19th century, we can see women fetching water at Rudabai Nivav. And at the photo to the right, we can see women tourists in 2018 at the Rudabai Nivav. This is well preserved by the Archaeological Survey of India, and it is designated as a monument of national importance. And they have even undertaken restoration work, as you can see in these before and after photos. The next stepwell is the Baihari Nivav, again, very intricately carved, built in the 15th century. And an inscription in the well suggests that it was commissioned by Baihari, the female superintendent of the Sultan. And though her identity is contested, most historic accounts say that she was the female superintendent of the Sultan. The stepwell is also maintained by the ASI, and the original structure is more or less intact. You can see in these before and after photos how little this stepwell has actually been altered or changed. And this is the drawing of the stepwell and the adjoining mosque and tomb of Baihari. The Jethabai Nivav can be traced to the historic suburb of Isanpur and was built in an orchard in the 19th century, known for its mangoes and palms. The stepwell irrigated an orchard and provided drinking water for livestock. And in this photograph from the 1880s, we can see that the water level is quite high up there. This is one of the upper pavilions of the stepwell. And when we visited the stepwell in 2015, shortly after the monsoon, this was the water level that we observed. And so, though there is water, you can actually see that the difference in water levels, which is a sign of the plummeting water tables. And again, this is maintained by the ASI. They even undertook restoration work, and it is surrounded by these expansive lawns, which are actually watered using a bore well, while the neighborhood is water stressed. And this is a drawing that our team, through our documentation, we drew this stepwell in a lot of detail. The next type of stepwells are the stepwells which have now been converted into temples. And an interesting one is the Ashapura Matani Vav in Bapunagar. And this is the lower levels, or rather the insides of the stepwell, which is still intact, as you can see. However, at the upper levels, the first pavilion has been converted into a temple, and it's covered by these bright red tiles and has a temple dedicated to the goddess Ashapura. A settlement has grown around the stepwell, and these pavilions have been repurposed for drying clothes and grains. And an old man in the neighborhood has actually chosen his siesta spot right above the spiral staircase that leads to the well shaft below. And so a lot of these stepwells have been converted into temples, and the original use has been replaced. In this drawing, you can see that that's the temple, while the rest of the structure is intact, and you can see the ornamentation within the stepwell as well. This is another example of a stepwell converted into a temple. It is the 11th century Mata Bhavani Niva, and the stepwell is dry, but it houses various small shrines. A later edition of the shrine dedicated to the local goddess is in the rear wall of the stepwell, as you can see in this drawing. And families residing along the edge of the stepwell maintain the stepwell. Worshippers, visitors, birds, and animals come to the stepwell, and it has become an embodiment of a living well, even though the water is gone. Almost, well, I would say all this, and there's many more examples like this of stepwells converted into temples. All the temples are invariably dedicated to the goddess. And in that sense, they are still associated with femininity and divinity. And it's again women who come here regularly. Of course, there's all worshippers, but women in particular come to some of these temples to perform rituals related to fertility and so on, and worship. So it's still a part of their everyday routine in some ways, though it's not necessarily to fetch water, but it's a part of the routines of the community, their conversion into temples. And on the other end of the spectrum lie stepwells like this in the walled city in the Doshiwadani pole. The stepwell lies on private property, uncared for, and it is dilapidated. The step corridor is inaccessible, and our team had to literally jump into it from the parapet wall of a neighboring house. And you can see this in this drawing, the cross section of the stepwell and how narrow and compact it is, and it's engulfed by the fabric of the walled city. And the last one that I'm going to show is the stepwell in the village of Bhadaj. It is buried and under unbridled vegetation and has been only partially excavated. And though it is completely ruined and nature has taken over, during festivals, priests from the nearby temple light lamps around the stepwell. And in that sense, there is still the idea of the sacred associated with the stepwell in some way. And this is the drawing which shows the temple adjoining the stepwell and the partially buried stepwell. So the current condition of Ahmedabad stepwells vary greatly, and what we observe falls broadly into the categories of preservation, inhabitation, disintegration, and ruination. However, all the stepwells that we documented have been severed from the former social and ecological networks. So whether musified or dilapidated, these stepwells are at a risk of being forgotten as providers of the fundamental need for water. And when contemplating the future of the legacy and heritage amid shifting notions of function and identity, it is important to remember the larger ecological patterns of water harvesting that were unique to this region. And drawing upon our documentation, I will now hand it over to Tanvi, who has been researching and working towards potential strategies and how we can reimagine the future of these structures and the future of the water in the city at large. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Tanvi.
Okay. Great. So I'll just share my screen. Mm. One second, I'm just going to make it full screen. Oh. All right. So the initiative and the documentation work done for the exhibitions that Priyanka talked about, in some sense became a starting point for my master's thesis at the Cambridge University. The course I'm doing is essentially a hybrid of research through design and devising technical solutions to issues of today. Now, one has to join the program with a distinct area of interest, which for me is water infrastructure of semi-arid regions and cities. And the question is basically how one can build water resilient and equitable cities today. And the other essential question I'm asking is how ancient water harvesting knowledge can inform urgent issues of water supply and water management in cities today, especially in semi-arid areas of India. So I'll be speaking about Ahmedabad, but really most of what I say is also relevant and applicable to other semi-arid cities, which include Baroda. Like most large cities that do not have a perennial river supply, Ahmedabad and its growing population is sustained by expansive and monumental dam canal infrastructure that diverts water from the distant Narmada, which sort of carries water from 200 kilometers away all the way to Ahmedabad. This satellite image on the top shows the sheer expanse of the canal infrastructure. And below is a photograph of large water pipes that bring water, that provision Bangalore and sort of bring water from the remote watersheds to sort of supply through municipal networks. We all know of the Sabarmati riverfront and how that has become a political symbol. Now, these satellite images on the left show the two large barrages that hold a perennial water supply of transported canal water. And the right is the concreted promenade, which sort of has altered the ecology and the seasonality of the Sabarmati River. In this project, the riverbed is used for finance generation at the cost of disrupting its seasonality. And this has now become a model and a new template for developing river edges across the city. And as you all might already know, that many such riverfronts are being proposed and by paving of these natural floodplains. And one was also proposed for the city of Baroda. This here is a central supply map of Ahmedabad with the canal emptying in the Sabarmati to the city's north. And as you can see, many areas in the east do not have supply network. Major extraction wells are marked in red and the supply network is marked in orange. Large quantities of water, of groundwater especially, is extracted from greater depths using these radial collector wells on the riverbed. And thousands of tube wells tap water from deep aquifers. Now, such expansionist and extractive infrastructural growth to supply any growing city assumes that water is abundant, that it is ubiquitous in nature. And such a paradigm of growth is underscored by the wishful idea of limitless fresh water, which is supposed to be provided by the state. But the reality is far from this. Most people in semi-arid regions do not have a stable water source throughout the year. These are photographs of women whose houses are not connected to the central water grid within the city on the left and on the outskirts of Ahmedabad on the right. When there is a complete dependence on the state, water becomes a tool for political manipulation. And so there is increasing disparity and inequality around its access. Minorities and economically weaker groups rely on precarious water sources. And this illustrates, in some sense, the emergence of exclusive hydraulic citizenship. The everyday struggle and labor of women who have to walk large distances points to the way in which gender, their economic background, and even religion intersect to make them more vulnerable to the water crisis. So my thesis questions this attitude towards water that is premised on indefinite extraction and the only central provision to support urban expansion. The attempt and the idea is to conceive a shift from practices of water depletion to renewal, recharge, and regeneration. The hypothesis is that in imagining this shift, it is critical to acknowledge the larger ecological patterns, as was done beautifully in the legacy of water harvesting structures that Ashini talked about at length. So turning to the region's history, we've seen that the artistry and skill of harvesting water evolved in different regions based on their climate and local geographies. Stepwells and other water harvesting structures like ponds and ponds sustained settlements, and the dwellings were strategically built on higher ground, the take row, and the streets emerged along the natural drainage lines. And the rainwater was collected in these larger depressions, the natural depressions that form the talabs for use beyond the monsoons. The reservoirs located at the edge of the river, which you can see here, was filled with floodwater and rainwater runoff of the seasonal watercourses. But these social practices associated with harvesting began to degrade in the 19th century. And this was reinforced by colonial practices like imposition of ruinous rates of land tax, commodification of land, and dismantling of community control over natural resources. These hastened the destruction of the physical and the social institutions that managed and maintained the ecosystem of rainwater harvesting structures. Now, the colonial government set up municipal commissions that undertook civic projects and actively discouraged the use of wells and stepwells. And centralized pipe supply, although established with the best of intentions, was introduced in the city. And it marked the distinction of when the responsibility of water provision shifted from the community to the government, and the state became the major provider of water. This photograph on the left was taken in 1872, which Priyanka also showed, of women fetching water in Rudabai Vav in Adalaj. And on the right is a 2019 photograph of supply pipes in a city apartment. Then in the early 20th century, mechanized pumps or tube wells were introduced, again by the colonial state, primarily to expand irrigation and support industrialization of Gujarat. These hidden points pump out enormous quantities of water from great depths at a rate that is exponentially faster than groundwater reserves can seasonally be replenished. The tube well technology reshaped settlement patterns, and thousands of them were dug across the landscape in an unregulated manner. Water tables eventually plummeted, and lakes and wells dried up. And gradually, this ecology of shallow aquifer eroded, and this degradation continued in the post-colonial period. In the 60s and 70s, after India got independence, the region suffered multiple droughts. And to deal with those, the government upheld centralized technological solutions to create security as a matter of great urgency. In this photograph, you can see our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in the opening of the largest dam project, where he famously referred to dams as the modern temples. And dams became symbols of growth and development. And this is the Sardar Sarovar Dam that brings water to Baroda and to Ahmedabad from Narmada. Today, these cities have grown and have engulfed surrounding settlements. Many of the lakes have been infilled, grounds paved, and their watersheds have been built upon. Now, as we negotiate with heritage and infrastructural development when thinking of water futures, we have to think of a third way. So the idea is not to replicate the stepwell or its form or to suggest an impossible return to past practices, but think of a way that acknowledges both the historical complexity and demands of a burgeoning population. So my MOD project proposes that a synthesis of culture of traditional knowledge systems with policy, technology, and livelihood revival can enable the shift. So now in the following segment, I'll discuss some takeaways and lessons learned from Stepwells that was so deeply embedded in the social and ecological rhythms. So first one is collect water where it falls. So there have been sparse efforts to harvest rainwater, which have not gained momentum in cities like Ahmedabad and Baroda due to a continued focus on centrally supplied water. The potential, especially in the old city of Ahmedabad, is enormous, as every traditional house, as you can see in these photographs, has a rainwater cistern. This section of one such tank in the old city and the restoration of this existing system of approximately 10,000 tanks with a capacity ranging from 15 to 20,000 liters can be easily revived. And that is already a 200 million liter of additional water, additional private water, in fact. Policies such as subsidized interest rates for restoration efforts and reducing property taxes for houses with restored tanks can be positive steps to incentivize implementation. And at the domestic scale, these tanks can slow the water down and before it enters the recycling and filtration loop. And filtered water can be channeled into community hearths that accommodate gathering spaces. Such a shift to design practices that localize collection, replenish aquifers through recharge wells, use natural filtration systems, and passive cooling techniques can sort of steer a move towards self-sufficiency. Now, a rediscovery of traditional approaches highlights the potential of community-based harvesting efforts, suggesting a city-making and policy framework that privileges small-scale responses, and many such efforts at different scales can help contribute to a regional form. So this is an example illustrated. So this one here is an abandoned well in Vasna. For those who don't know, it's a neighborhood in Ahmedabad, which is now engulfed by informal settlements. Such stepwells in dense neighborhoods can be desilted and used for collecting roof water and street runoff. They can be reactivated as parallel infrastructure for water harvesting and distribution, which will also save significant expenditure on infrastructure installation from scratch. And the collected water can be redistributed for non-potable purposes. And we can also create productive terraces in the process. So community water cisterns that collect water which falls on the site could become the basis to build new neighborhoods and therefore localize water collection. In stepwells and open wells, the visibility of water signal sort of signal the approaching of summer or the time of plenty in the monsoons. And this change allows the community to alter behavior and usage. Now the system has been supplanted by an engineered network of hidden pipes and bowels that always keep the water invisible. It is devoid of any community involvement or any craft practices whatsoever. Now when we turn the tap on, we don't know where the water is really coming from or how much water does the river have or the dam has, or how long the water source is going to last. So this loss of signal can sort of, the idea is to overcome this loss through urban design by making the invisible water in dingy ducts and pipes visible again, so that we can engage with seasonality rather than sort of disrupt it. And again, this can be done by securing local supplies, bringing the water source back closer to where it's being used, so one can acclimatize to flexible usage patterns. Now, another major effect of massive infrastructural growth that we all see in our cities today is that we have moved away from being dependent on floods to being vulnerable to floods. Like a semi-arid city which needed that much water through the monsoons that was sort of replenished in the ground is now a reason of distress. And like, this is a photograph of Ahmedabad in 2017 when it was flooded. And soon after it was hit by drought in 2019. And this is all too common in most of our cities. And it's basically because we've lost the capacity to replenish the ground, and the increased runoff doesn't have place to sort of be stored post monsoons, as floodplains have been encroached upon. In response to this, at the watershed scale, city planning, it is proposed that city planning must underline the protection of low-lying areas and protect local bodies that store runoff and replenish groundwater. The drawing of the green belt of Ahmedabad here proposes to revive it by banning all building activity and using the open spaces to become places for collection, filtration, grey water recycling, and aquifer recharge. We have to create an architecture which is textured and porous, that negotiates with groundwater rather than separates from it. The cities and settlements are imagined as funnels to channelize water back in the aquifer, with recharge mechanisms at multiple scales, at the domestic scale, at the neighborhood scale, and at the settlement scale. Now, the upkeep of these practices that will maintain such a system depends on an active community, and also importantly, as water activist Vishwanath talks about a lot, linkages with livelihood and craft communities to ensure regular and sustained engagement. Unlike technological solutions that always tend to marginalize livelihoods, we have to reimagine them to be an important part, and they can also become more equitable ways of engaging these communities back in our societies. These are photographs by Vishwanath in Bangalore that show the well diggers there that are digging recharge wells and desilting old wells. And the other point that I spoke about in the beginning was how women are invariably more affected during a time of crisis. And they are crucial, but they're also the first responders when a drought strikes, and are crucial to efficient water resource management, and therefore well positioned to becoming water stewards. Their involvement at all levels of decision making can be a key to developing solutions. So today, the urban expansion and the city layout sadly pay little heed to the patterning of aquifers when mandating underground parking for commercial complexes and building underground metro stations. In large cities and urban areas, the building of underground metros and these parking lots sort of lead to their flooding, and it has also led to the drying up of stepwells. Like Priyanka mentioned, of the 17 stepwells that we documented in Ahmedabad, only 3 still access groundwater seasonally. So building activities must find terms of engagement with shallow aquifers rather than ignoring its underground water flows. Bylaws for parking should recognize these linkages and therefore create groundwater institutions that regulate building underground and prevent illegal private bore wells to be dug. The shallow aquifer is a large underground urban water cistern, if you can imagine it like that, which has a capacity to store and decentrally distribute rainwater at a very low cost in energy. And India depends, for its major consumption, it depends on groundwater. And it is the single largest user of the groundwater in the world, consuming over a quarter of the global total. And the figure is quite staggering. It is estimated that the use of groundwater is about 230 cubic kilometers annually. So it's absolutely crucial to recognize groundwater linkages institutionally, and perhaps even recognize the shallow aquifer as a living, breathing entity, as it is upon them that the futures of semi-arid cities depend. And in the end, since it's Heritage Day and we celebrate Stepwells of Gujarat as its invaluable heritage, I would like to say that the current efforts by the government and state agencies is to preserve the grander stepwells and make them tourist attractions, and kind of forget the smaller stepwells or smaller structures which were built for rainwater harvesting. Whether it is the stepwell in Adalaj, the Rudabaiva, or Baihari, which you would have all seen, but we hardly know about the smaller ones that Priyanka showed. And this single dimensional revival has contributed to their decontextualized musealization, rather than a renewal which is more holistic, which sort of keeps in mind their ecological and social dimensions also. And it is important to sort of remember this ecological dimension, which I can't reiterate more. And we should focus our efforts on, like I said, a holistic revival to bring the groundwater back, because what is a stepwell without water? After all, it's just, you know, a skeleton. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. And since all my professors and mentors and Pratyush and Riyaz are in the audience, I would love to sort of hear the critique on the work done so far, and yeah, work on and sort of get insight as to how to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tanvi. If you could just stop sharing the screen.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Tanvi, Priyanka, and Ashni for this really, really wonderful presentation. Tanvi, I think you still are sharing the screen. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this. Now, I think this was really terrific, because I think I was just taking notes while you all were presenting. And I think, Tanvi, you said it very aptly in the end, that what you're really looking for is an understanding that is beyond the artifact, an understanding that is holistic. And the two keywords, the ecological and social, are I think, the most important keywords for all the work that you have shown. And I really appreciate how you are really taking, or rather focusing on larger ecological systems, the question of water, the question of people and public at large. And I think that really is a very, very refreshing way of looking at this question of stepwells. So it's not really study of an artifact. And I think it was so well covered, Ashni, right from your kind of a historical perspective, a regional geographical perspective of the problem, to the way Priyanka emphasized, and I think that's very useful for young scholars, the question of methods, the question of representation, what kind of processes you followed, and how you articulated the other side, the social angle, the caste angle, the question of gender, while looking at these structures, and also how you emphasize the contemporary quirky appropriation, which also gives us a lot of hope. A person sleeping on top of it, or these flags that are put up and appropriated, and so nicely concluded by Tanvi, who in her thesis is looking for answers, where to take this forward, rather than be content with some kind of a beautiful documentation. So thanks for this. This was terrific stuff. We really, everyone here, myself, Riyaz, and I'm sure Riyaz is also there. Great. We're all really proud of you. And Riyaz started it all. I remember that. And now we'll have questions from people present here. I'll have to just figure out, because our tech fellow Dinesh has left. But before, I'll have the privilege, I would like to take this opportunity to start with the first question. And Priyanka, this is in some sense an ongoing conversation we have been having, and it'd be nice to bring this conversation out. And this is something I've been saying. Well, documentation of heritage, or an interest in heritage, is, historically speaking, it's really in the 70s and 80s that it picks up. It is that moment in history when there is a disillusionment with the high modernist way of thinking. And we in India become very conscious of who we are. This is the time of Asiad and the Apna Utsav. And we have seen those documentations of historical structures starting in 70s and 80s in different institutes in India. And I had always maintained that this was the first time we were looking back, or we were always documenting. ASI was documenting in the colonial era, but let's forget that for a while. But there was a kind of a romance around heritage. This kind of this is us. This is what we want to do, and this is what we want not to lose, etc., etc. But that's in the 70s and 80s. A lot of water has passed since. And how does your documentation and representation today is trying to move away from that naive romance about history, which is something I even mentioned about our Heritage Center? And how do you feel the way you represent is able to, in some sense, not fall into the self-oriental trap of documentation? And that's I know it's a bit of a loaded question. It's a worthwhile question to attempt. Since this is 2020, and I think anyone, Priyanka, you want to take this?
Yeah, I'll start, and Ashini and Tanvi, please weigh in, because this is an ongoing conversation that I had with Pratyush recently. I think one of the things that when we started, we were perhaps not as conscious of these larger questions and the politics of documentation. Who is documenting? What are you documenting? And the idea of subjectivity is something I briefly touched upon, but I will reiterate. Subjectivity of the content that we are documenting, and subjectivity as authors maybe, or people who are producing this work. And I think it's an ongoing process, but documentation where you are documenting it just objectively, I want the measurements, I want to replicate it. What if, how can we evolve documentation processes to embed subjectivity? And I think that's a very interesting conversation. Also, how do you, with documentation in terms of digital technologies, like now you have point clouds, and you can basically have like the entire walkthrough of a stepwell potentially on your cell phone. So it's an evolving. I think methods or tools are evolving, but at the same time, what is critical, at least to us as a group, and again, I said, Tanvi and Ashini, please weigh in with your thoughts, is also embedding our subjectivity. And also, we are very conscious of the fact that we are, at this point, this work has kind of proliferated outside of India as well. And the fact that we are South Asian authors of a South Asian context is something we are very conscious of as well. And moving away from this, or at least positioning ourselves as that way, is also something that we are conscious of in our mind. And I think, Tanvi, you might want to talk more about techniques and also the thought process, how you go about, how you keep on, those drawings are evolving as well. And then we can talk more about it. And Ashini can talk more about the on-site experiences. And please be nice to share that as well.
So I think we've been having this conversation since the very start. Even in the first exhibition, when we first just found these stepwells, and there were these, these CAD drawings almost that the team was making. We felt that it was not doing justice to what we're talking about. And then there was this whole conversation with Riaz, and we came up with the idea of also doing context drawings, because it was so important to see where the stepwell and how diverse their contexts are today. Some of them are, of course, like Priyanka said, are monuments, and they're very interesting to look at as architects, as pieces, as exquisite structures. But others which are sort of now part of, other social neighborhoods with a certain density that's sort of taken over, or now which are taken over by plants and by animals, and Mata Bhavani Vav in Asarwa, which is, you cannot draw that stepwell without drawing what has happened to the well shaft, to the kund towards the end, where there are these beautiful plants. But I think like Priyanka said, it's an ongoing exercise, and we keep finding new research, and we keep adding to those drawings, we keep changing them. And So I think we're quite aware of the fact that they are dated as soon as they're drawn, because it's so, it's changing so fast, everything around it. So yeah.
And Ashini can talk more about the more like the empirical, just documentation. I think there is, when you have everything drawn at the same scale at the, and Ashini has been
So
kind of
done a lot of work in Chanderi, so there's a lot of
Yeah, so
Yes.
I was primarily involved with making the technical architectural drawings and recording all the details and the motifs. And while it is conservative, it has its own place and its value. So we had a process. It was a process of layering things on. So I produced the sort of technical architectonics, and then Tanvi added on top of the same drawing, she added the details of paraphernalia and the context and all of that. So I think both of those things have their place. As she mentioned that some of these structures are monuments in their own right and do not yet have a protected status. So probably creating a base of documentation for some of these structures can at least be a starting point to initiate a conversation about whether or not they need some restoration works. If so, to what extent? How surgically does a preservationist want to intervene in this space? So I think having a precise as well as an interpretative document of the same things, both have their own place and are both required.
Yeah. No, I think, what is most fascinating about the drawing is how it invokes a context. And it invokes a context which is not just a romantic view. It is grim, it is dirty, it is there, it is used. So in some sense, there's I can already imagine a paper that you can write just on representation of stepwells and how is this representation very different from, because stepwells have been drawn right from 50s, 60s. There is a tradition of drawing the stepwells. And I think there's a lot of meat here I can see, academically speaking, but I'll stop here because this is not our history class. And I will, I'm sure there's some questions here in the Zoom room, and people listening to us on YouTube, our students can write their questions to Shalini or Pragya on WhatsApp, and they can read out those questions. Or somebody can write the question on the chat box if they wish to. Riaz, do you want to come in?
Riaz, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Riaz. You're still on mute, Riaz. He doesn't know.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you will have to, the host will have to unmute Riaz.
Oh, because, yeah.
Yeah. Can you unmute yourself now?
Thank you.
Yes.
No, I could not unmute myself, which is very rare. I'm always ready to be unmuted. No, it's so wonderful to see how this these documentation is developing over over the years. And Pratyush, I just wanted to kind of respond to your question, about because I think that there's a really important aspect of historicity that the mode of documentation has had from the beginning. And it was extremely deliberate. And I remember the conversations around it in 2015-16. And that is that if you look at, let's say, Raj Rewal's portfolio, or if you look at the Vistara catalogs, and you look at the early kind of documentation processes, right from Batley onwards, there is a kind, as you called it, there is a kind of romance of the past. And there's an airbrushing of the context to fit into that particular spatiality of romance and longing and so on and so forth. I think that what has happened is that that in that framework of historicity, the origin of the building becomes very important. And when we talk about conservation and when we talk about heritage, we generally assume that we are the aim is if there is a conservatory or a restoration kind of approach, that we will restore it back to its original state. Now that's a hugely contentious and political kind of, and as our country is right now like extremely divided about things of original value and so on, you can imagine that this is a potent thing. So really where the documentation makes a really big step forward is that it situates itself in the now. And that's why it will constantly be evolving. We will be constantly documenting the now. And that now is not just the physical space of the stepwell, but, and I mean, we've been talking about this about taking it further. For example, the very context into which it is embedded assumes that the city is the center and one is looking outwards from the city. And in that sense, the city is the stepwell is an urban form of infrastructure. But if you start looking at it from the view perspective, as Ashini pointed out, of the pastoralist, of the moving army, of the agriculturalist, or from the tiny settlement to the city, we might have to change our vocabulary of thinking about the stepwell as perhaps agricultural infrastructure. Now, I don't know, in the last 50 years, I haven't heard of a architectural school or a studio that has framed a question that talks about, let's say, food infrastructure or animal infrastructure and its relationship to the city in that sense. And the stepwell is an interesting kind of form of that, notably in terms of what that's the. So I'm just saying that I think that the premise of documentation in the now problematizes heritage in very interesting ways, which is what we were concentrating on in the first kind of exhibition, and it has become only bigger and bigger problem with each exhibition.
Thanks for this, Riaz. And I think, by the way, Riaz Tayebji is a professor, has been a professor at CEPT, graduate of CEPT, and author, writer, and a colleague and a good friend. And he's one who started all this when all of these young scholars were students, and then this work has had a life of its own. Priyanka, you have a question?
You muted again, yes.
Oh, he muted himself again. So I'll just hold on. I need to look for.
Yeah, no. Just a small correction. I didn't start this. It just happened. So, I mean, I think that in terms of authorship, it's very important to kind of.
Thanks for being modest.
No, it's not. But anyway, we'll leave it there.
Good. Yeah. Priyanka, you wanted to ask a question. Are you able to unmute yourself? Can you do it now?
Yes. Yeah. So, hi Priyanka, Tanvi, Ashini. So good to see you after a very long time. First of all, I would love to appreciate the kind of work that you have done. It's really commendable. I remember seeing that exhibition, and now to what Tanvi is kind of doing, and all the research that even Priyanka and Ashini have kind of taken it. I'm really looking forward to the book. It says sold out right now, so I'm going to be behind you to get it. I would like to actually comment on the work that you have done by saying that the kind of documentation that, I mean, that's something that Pratyush has been talking about right now. The whole idea of the cultural manifestation of these stepwells with the kind of context we live in, and the way Tanvi pointed out that it also gives this ecological imprint of something being present. And, so, and I think when you said about the drawing, Tanvi, that, making a CAD drawing of this, and while I was looking at the drawing, that's exactly the first thing that came to my mind, that had this been only a CAD drawing, because I have also seen a lot of drawings of stepwell, it wouldn't have been giving that, the whole manifestation component would have been missed out. Also, when you talk of stepwells, it's not just an entity in itself, it's about the larger landscape of a city, and you're talking of a water system, and how this whole thing, it's not just at that point, it's more of a large context where, because it's water, and the whole landscape study that we really talk about. I want to ask all three of you one thing, that we talk a lot about drawing and documentation, and I think you have done a lot of it now. Where do you contextually place the writing of this, because as equal to drawing, I feel even the writing, the way you write, because that's something that we really struggle when we do the architecture history studio etc., where we have most of the times there are no drawings available, so it's always the text which you actually read and then translate it into a form in forms of drawings. In this case, it's more of I'm sure there is a lot of literature, but in a lot of empirical work which Ashini did, I doubt that there's a lot of literature then that's available. It's actually the drawings which would kind of help you, to get into different connections that you build. So how would you position that?
So should I go first?
Yes. Yeah.
So what you said yourself, the experience of having done the drawings and having been to these Stepwells, and that because first the drawings came, and then we became interested in the subject academically, which we didn't even know that these many Stepwells existed in Ahmedabad. Therefore, this system of water provision is something one must look at academically. So because in this process, the method was sort of, if I can say, it came, the doing came first. It has also helped the writing process, but it keeps evolving as well. Like, I think our understanding, the writing in the initial exhibitions is of the city, and now, with the added dimension of the point of view of pastoralists and settlers, that's also sort of adding new dimensions. But it was quite crude, if I could use that word. And only now, after having spent a few years looking at it academically, have we been able to, and a lot of discussions with Riaz and other people, we've been now able to put it together. But again, I think having done or having been to so many of these Stepwells really helped being able to write about them.
Yeah. Just to add a point about writing, and actually more recently, the three of us have been, writing quite a bit. Also, the mode of presentations, like the exhibitions, it changed, especially during the pandemic. And I would make a point about that for the latest one, which was at the Cooper Union, now which is up permanently on the World Wide Web, we wrote 5 essays, almost 1,500 words each. And I think it kind of pushed us in a dimension where we became conscious of, larger histories, reading other scholars beyond architects. Like, there are some scholars that we had been referring to, Mona Livingston and Yuta Jenna. There's the Stepwell textbooks, but also really looking at scholarship on trade, scholarship on water, scholarship on, water and drought. And there's just, and it's a whole world out there that has always been, in the academic world, it has been there. It's just that we are beginning to tap into other disciplines, and the language of many other disciplines is writing. For us, it started off with drawing, and it's I think that is very much work in progress. And again, as authors, we still situate ourselves as South Asian authors. I keep reiterating this, maybe because of the context that I'm in, where I'm in the West at this point, and I realize it even more. I cannot emphasize it enough that we really have positionality is very important as well, as far as authorship or writing about something goes, and we are quite conscious of our position in this domain.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Professor Yachnik, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah. Thank you. Right. Firstly, on behalf of Navarachna University, I wish to thank all the 3 speakers, Tanvi, Priyanka, and Ashni, for a wonderful perspective today on Stepwells in Ahmedabad. And thanks also to Professor Pratyush, Dean of SEDA, for a wonderful moderation. Thanks to the Heritage Trust also, who's partnered with the Navarachna University Center for Heritage. And as Professor Pratyush had said, this is a new center that has just come up recently. We have a very prominent advisory board also here. One of our advisory board members of the center, Sandhya-ben Gajjar, is also here. Thank you for joining us today. There are several people from Germany as well as the United States who are also on the board of the Heritage Trust. And there are several activities that we are planning. And hopefully when the situation improves, I'd like to invite all of you to our university for a physical exhibition of several of the things that our center has been doing all these months. So thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, it was very nice to hear about the city of my birth. I was born in Ahmedabad, so it was nice to reconnect back. I just want to understand, studies. I mean, I understand that there are some 2,000 step wells in India, surviving step wells, and that's where I read somewhere. However, most of the studies that I've seen cover about step wells in Gujarat area. Are there studies done outside Gujarat area? The step wells done outside? I'll be keen on knowing that. Also, I understand that Gujarat has the maximum number of step wells, some 100 or so. So any specific reason why this part of India had, specifically Gujarat, had the maximum step wells in our country?
I think this one's for
Ashini.
Ashini.
Ashini, about
All right. So for my research thesis, which I did under the guidance of Pratyush sir, I visited Chanderi. It's a small town of medieval origins in Madhya Pradesh, and you wouldn't believe it. It's a small town with 30,000 inhabitants. It's formerly a walled city, just the way Ahmedabad used to be. And in such a small town, I found a dense concentration of up to above 70 functioning wells, which are still, integral to the lives of the people. Their purposes they're not as elaborate and as ornamental as the stepwells of Gujarat. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we get to hear so much more about Gujarat, is because there's this aspect of artistry and craft that is attached to a lot of them. Stepwells in a lot of other places, like in Deccan, the ones that are carved out of basalt, directly carved into the rock, are the ones which I saw in Chanderi that were directly carved into the sandstone. They're not as elaborate, they're just more like rudimentary holes in the ground, and they have a step access leading down to water. So there's somewhat a hybrid between a tank and a well in itself. But from my experience in Chanderi, which is still sort of like a small town, it mostly relies on, most of the town is engaged in handloom weaving and agriculture. So there's still traditional professions. A lot of these stepwells have remained intact and are a big part of people's occupational lives. A lot of these wells lie in small private farms, so they're used for agriculture and irrigation. A lot of the stepwells which are within the town are located in prime town squares next to mosques or temples. So a lot of small temple trusts and religious communities are invested in their upkeep and their and their conservation. And what was interesting to note was that many of these stepwells were modified not for the process, not for from a preservationist point of view, but more from a pragmatic point of view. So many of them were basically still used as wells, but their stepped corridors were filled in. So the well itself remains intact. All the other frills and paraphernalia around it was often eliminated, and people are using them with solar pumps for agriculture or for mixing cement, in the inner city. So I think there is a bit of an amnesia about other regions. I think Ahmedabad, Delhi, and Rajasthan structures have received quite a lot of attention, perhaps because the conservation communities in these cities are very powerful. But I think there is a lot to be seen in how these structures are integral to the lives of small rural or artisanal towns.
Okay. Also, I think it's interesting to talk about patronage here, as when earlier on in the community, it would be looked at as an act of, a great gesture for the community to be constructing a well. So this effort was taken up by various people, not just the rulers, not just the kings and the queens, but also people who could afford building wells. It was an act of benevolence to be able to provide water to the community. And water being so scarce in these regions, in Gujarat and Rajasthan, parts of central India, it is therefore, I think, why so many of these step wells at various scales, not just the big ones, but also really small wells, which are merely 1 meter wide, were built.
Yeah. Just to add to this, I think also, again, bringing in trade and trade routes is important. The Delhi Gulf of Khambat corridor and trade, and how these were, we often use these analogy. They were almost like service stations that you might find on a highway today, or petrol pumps is sometimes what we like to kind of draw an analogy. It's also, the density is also very often related to traffic in like contemporary terms. And the trade route, the northwestern corridor to the Gulf of Khambat, also has a role to play in terms of perhaps concentration, so architectural elaboration. That's where the capital is coming from, through the trade. The other thing is that the stepwell, it's of course we talk about it in India, but it's also a typology which, or at least some of these that you see in parts of, in fact, parts of Southern Europe and the Middle East. And one can perhaps imagine the sea trade and, how ideas of architecture might have perhaps proliferated, and there are borrowings which kind of go beyond the Indian subcontinent as well. And that's a larger typology. In fact, in the form of the well and the steps is something you see even in a lot of Latin American pre-Columbian cultures, in Peru, in Mexico, and so on. So it's very interesting, but also the Arabian Sea, the trade route, and I think that also is also something that led to a certain concentration and perhaps architectural elaboration, and like Tanvi mentioned, patronage.
Thanks for that. I think it's a very interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah.
This will take one question from the student, or maybe more if there are. Let's see how much time we have. This is from Ninas. She's a student in thesis. And this is a question to all of you. Did you get to know about any other social issues related to abandoned stepwells, which were not subjected to your documented research? So what have you missed out? That's what she's trying to say. But were as important to be noted down and to think about?
Yes.
That's a very, very interesting question.
Yes. Very good question.
Ahmedabad, which is close to Ahmedabad, a while back, and there's a long 15th century stepwell right in the city center, at the intersection of the primary streets. And it was completely abandoned and it was locked. And when I spoke to the people that it's right in the city center and it's occupying so much space in a prime location, why is it that it stays locked? And they said that one of the main reasons is safety. Women are not safe there anymore. It's become sort of like a dungeon for nefarious activities and crime. And I think that's important to consider because they're dark, they're remote, they're so deep. So considering where they are located in the city, in what context, I think safety is a very big concern for a lot of people, especially in smaller towns related to these structures, which have poor nighttime illumination and issues of that. So that was one thing that I noted.
The other thing which was quite a revelation was when we sort of read about how these structures were also part of a very stringent caste structure and caste hierarchies, which were part of the society at that point. And like only a certain kind of people could access water from a certain well, and there would be separate wells for different communities. And that was a very prominent aspect of how water was, so it wasn't like it was equitable even at that point. There were issues and of access, of distribution and availability for certain kind of people. So even like when we do look back at these structures, we have to be cognizant of that today when we sort of reimagine sort of their revival or sort of look at them as water places for water again. That was another point.
And the third one, just to add, which is kind of going into a slightly otherworldly dimension, but it is also interesting how a lot of this idea of the spirit and the Mataji and this is there are a lot of these during our documentation process. We kind of the people would tell us, and also I think Riaz might know more when we did the documentation in Vadwan of the Stepwell and all the stories associated. And not stories of the past, but stories of the otherworldly dimension living in the Stepwell today. And I think that is also very interesting and very much prevalent, which of course we haven't touched upon in our documentation. But it's a very like, oh, when we were documenting, they're like, make sure you finish by a certain time because the spirit will come. Like those kind of on the ground experiences, which we haven't captured yet, but I think it's as real or as unreal as it can get, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandhya, you wanted to ask a question. Try unmuting yourself. Yeah, please.
Can I speak now?
Yeah, please do. You can switch on the video if it's all right, or it's okay.
Please unmute.
Yes, you can speak, Sandhya.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
A few years back, I was doing this exhibition on which I call the Web of Water for some people in the US, in the UK. And I was looking at this nursery rhyme, which is very popular, called Jack and Jill went up the hill with a pail of water. Obviously, there was a well on top of the hill. And I thought that was really a contradiction in terms, because when you look at water, you look at the lowest possible point on ground where water settles. So how can there be a well at the top of a hill? And then I went to Junagadh, and in what is called on a heritage, exploratory kind of a visit with Sumesh Modi, and we went to a place called, I think, Upper Court. It is called. It's kind of a hilly area on the edge of Junagadh, and we found actually two stepwells. Not found, they were there. Everybody knew about it. Two stepwells on top of that hill. So I just want to know, how does a well work on a hill?
So it's very common for a lot of fortified hilly sites to have these stepwells. Also, a lot of monastic sites that are carved into the hillsides. So very often, depending on the rock composition of the hill, I believe it's Junagadh, so it must be basaltic. Sometimes between the cracks and the veins of the rocks, you have water that percolates, and sometimes there are natural springs, typically towards the edges of a lot of these hilly sites. So those are usually the main sources of water on hilltops, and they're often significantly deeper than the wells that you find foothills or in the plains.
Oh, thank you very much. That was quite illuminating. I will work on that a little more. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks for this. Thanks for this question. That's an intriguing question. Alka, I think it's a Sunday evening. It's getting late, and I think we will have to. Unfortunately, this is a wonderful conversation all of us have been having, and I'm sure we'll find more forums to take this conversation forward. As also Professor Yachnik said, that we're very excited about the new center we have. And as soon as things open up, we'll love to call all of you here physically. But really great presentation, all three of you, wonderful. So happy to see how this work that I'd witnessed 6-7 years back at the Kanoria Center take a life of its own, and very very satisfying to see how you all are pursuing what you really believe in. And with this, I would like to invite Alka Smart. She is the Honorary Secretary for the Heritage Trust of Baroda to say a few words of thanks. Alka, I'll have to unmute you just a minute. Can you try unmuting right now? Are you able to?
Yeah.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. What a wonderful talk we've had by our three lovely speakers. On behalf of Team Heritage Trust, I thank you, Priyanka, Ashni, and Tanvi, for the wonderful information about our architectural gems, the Stepwells. We thoroughly enjoyed listening to you girls. Our sincere thanks to Professor Pratyush Shankar, Dean of SEDA, Navrashna University, for introducing the speakers and moderating the talk and handling the question answer session. Thanks to Navrashna University too for partnering with the Heritage Trust for this event. I would like to thank all the people who joined us this afternoon on Zoom to listen to this talk. I really appreciate your taking time on a Sunday afternoon to be with us. The times are really tough due to the corona scare, and I sincerely hope that we will soon have a face-to-face event rather than a virtual one. Till then, do please take very good care of yourself and remain healthy and safe. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.